Okay, so today I am in London, to be exact, Gardner Leader's office in Chancery Lane with Harry Stewart-Moore. Thanks very much, Harry, for agreeing to talk to us today.
Not at all, thanks for having me.
I think you're the first person from the legal profession that we've had on, so it's another first for betting people. And assuming people are less clued up than I am, or as at least clued up as I am, you're a litigator specialising in commercial sports gambling disputes.
Yeah.
What in layman's terms is a litigator?
So a litigator is a lawyer that specialises in disputes. So you've got lots of different types of lawyers. You might have people who help with your purchase of your house or your commercial contracts, your employment. Litigators are the ones who get involved when things have gone wrong, basically, and it can be anything from someone who might represent you in front of the local magistrates for a driving offence, all the way up to Lord Panic in the Supreme Court, fighting over the meaning of the Constitution. So it's a very broad spectrum, but my areas in backgrounds in commercial disputes, so people in business suing other people in business, generally speaking.
Okay, so you said that we're at Gardner Leaders, but it's a fairly new move for you.
That's
Previously, right. You formed Stewart-Moore Solicitors with your father, Christopher.
That's right, yeah. So I started off at a firm called Watson, Farley and Williams, which is an international city firm. I trained there and spent 5 years there as a commercial litigator, and that's sort of the glamorous kind of side of the law. I was able to travel to places like the British Virgin Islands and Monaco, Istanbul, Bangkok, and litigate in all those sort of jurisdictions in various in front of various tribunals. And then decided to stop doing that really because I wanted to do things with a bit more of a human element. My father, Christopher, was a defamation lawyer, basically, so media lawyer that also did some work in racing, and we decided to sort of join up in about 2013, I think it was. And from then until quite recently, I was doing a sort of mixture of commercial disputes, horse racing work, which I basically nicked off my dad. And from that grew a gambling disputes practice as well, which came out of the horse racing stuff. And then we had a very busy year last year. We had a few things that went to trial, and at the end of that, my plan had been to sort of look at joining up with someone else. Dad was retiring, basically, and I started talking to a few firms, but I talked to Gardner Leader and really liked them, and decided to join up, really, sort of take the plunge. And part of it was because I was getting a lot of things that I couldn't do, because as a litigator, you're restricted to doing disputes. But if a client came to me wanting to buy a equestrian facility or something like that, I had to hand it to another firm. So I thought it would be good to be a full service firm, which Gardner Leader is, and I'm at the Chancery Lane office, but there's a big office in Newbury as well, which is of course quite helpful for the horse racing side of things. So I joined up with them really quite recently, about 6 weeks ago.
Okay, now if you don't mind me rewinding a bit, people would have heard of your father's case, at least one of them.
Yes.
The most famous made news at 10 at the time, top Cees, involving Jack and Linda Ramsden.
That's right.
I mean, so you've inherited the...
Yeah, I've nicked it. Yeah, it helps having the same surname. But yes, he was able to sort of combine media law and racing law as a result of that case. He was instructed by Jack and Linda and Kieran Fallon against Sporting Life, who'd said that Jack Ramsden had told Kieran to stop top Cees, and they won it. And it went on from there, really, and Dad sort of became synonymous, I suppose, with Kieran, who kept him very busy over the years doing fake shake articles, dealing with those, and he was part of the team with John Kelsey-Fry doing the criminal proceedings. But he did an awful lot of work in racing generally. He worked, did work for Frankie Dettori and lots of jockeys, lots of trainers, I came along in 2013 and just sort of started doing the same thing and took over, really, I guess.
And was your dad a racing man anyway?
Oh, absolutely. Yeah, no, it was his first love. He's a complete anorak. He was a very early adopter of speed figures, and he's still got Ken Hussey's standard times, which he keeps under lock and key, and he's still very keen on all that sort of thing. But he's got an unbelievably retentive brain for that kind of thing. You need that to be a proper racing man. and he can remember sort of almost every race he's ever seen. And even recently, while I was working with him, he used to sort of slightly drive you mad. You just get tons of telephone calls from people in racing asking for his views on upcoming races. Lots of punters, trainers, jockeys. So he certainly knows his stuff, and I suppose and I learned a lot from him as a result. But his probably biggest badge of honour was during the Tylicki trial. We used Jim McGrath as the rules expert, and at the end of it, he basically said to Dad, crikey, you know your stuff. So I think he's had a grin on his face pretty much ever since that conversation.
Have you inherited the interest in racing yourself? You're racing?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I don't think you could do the work I do without following the sport quite closely. It's difficult, and I think that's one of the problems that racing faces at the moment is how much of it there is. It's difficult to keep up with it, but I tend to do it via podcasts actually nowadays, because it's so hard to actually watch live racing. I tend to keep up with what's going on via podcasts, and I have in my time got heavily into it. When I was at university, I was at Newcastle, and we spent a lot of time going around the tracks up there, Newcastle, Hexham, and we made our own variations of Dad's speed figures and did pretty well out of it actually. But it's enormously time consuming, so you can't really be a lawyer, and although Dad managed it sort of, but it's just too time consuming. So I definitely follow it, but not nearly in the same way that a lot of my clients do, basically.
Okay, now we've talked about your father's stuff, but you have been part of the legal team behind some of racing's biggest, most recent cases.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I've been really lucky. They've been really interesting cases, and they're not just sort of really big in racing. They're actually quite big in the world of sports law for various reasons that to do with the laws that were dealt with. So the two biggest would have been the Jim Best proceedings with the BHA, and then more recently Freddy Tylicki's claim in the High Court against Graham Gibbons, and those were two very big cases. And I've done lots of things in between, things that are less well known. We always tended to be instructed in the sort of, when you're in BHA work, in the bigger investigations that involved allegations of race fixing and gambling issues, which is sort of how I managed to segue into a gambling practice, really. But yes, we've been involved in pretty much constantly. The first thing I did was Fergal Lynch's application to get his licence back, which I'm pleased to say was eventually successful. Then pretty much straight away, I think we did the Sky Lantern and Elusive Kate Falmouth Stakes appeal to try and get that trying to get the result reversed for Richard Hannon Jr. and Richard Hughes unsuccessfully. That was my first brush with the rules on interference. I remember the BHA presented this Pythagorean theory with charts and things all over it. It was quite extraordinary. It was almost to the point where people were sort of getting their protractors out in the trying to work out to the extent that ground had been lost. And I'm pleased to say that those graphs seems to have bitten the dust, but it was slightly different in those days.
Now it must be high pressure when you're working on these high profile cases, because if you win them, then I imagine that's the best advert you could possibly get for a legal firm. If you lose them, could be equally as detrimental. So do you feel the pressure?
Well, it's never my fault if I lose, but it's all down to me if we win. No, of course, yeah. You want to. You get as a litigator, you get very personally involved in the outcome, definitely, because you see people at their most stressed, and it's hard not to be very sympathetic to that. So certainly you want to win it just generally, but yeah, of course, big wins are a better advert than losses, yeah. And
you also involved with Towster?
Yes, Towster Racecourse. I worked for quite a while and worked closely with Lord Hesketh and Kevin Ackerman there, and that was a real eye-opener. And there's quite a lot of, that was sort of my baptism of fire into the Greyhound industry at that time, because you'll remember they built that beautiful Greyhound stadium there, put so much effort and time and money into it, and there wasn't a thing they didn't do to try and get that up and running at a time when Greyhound racing really needed an injection of enthusiasm and investment, and it didn't really work, sadly, but they, not for lack of, try. It should have worked, actually, in my view, but I think that it wasn't so much there was resistance within the greyhound racing industry, but there was sort of, they couldn't quite understand why anyone was bothering, seemed to be the sort of overarching impression I got, and they just sort of thought, why are you spending all this money on this sport, and I think maybe the bookmakers were slightly too in control of it at that time anyway. And the attitude seemed to be, let's just try and make money out of this today, because perhaps we're not going to be around, for very long. And I think that was the opposite attitude that was needed for a project like Toaster. So that was a great pity, but it was a real learning experience. I worked with them for sort of 4 or 5 years, yeah.
And did you have any background in greyhound racing?
No, I mean, I used to go to Wimbledon Dogs quite a lot, which is, in those days, was enough to put anyone off going greyhound racing, really, because it was falling apart. But again, it just showed you what Toaster could have been. And I know Ben was a huge supporter of it, and sponsored the Greyhound Derby there. I mean, they got the Greyhound Derby, I think, the first year that they opened, pretty much. And yeah, it should have done a lot better than it did, but there you go.
And Lord Hesketh's a very colourful character, one that I've not managed to bag.
Oh no,
how was he?
You must get him. He's quite how much of it you'll be able to publish is another matter, but you must get Alexander on. He's has a fascinating life, extremely shrewd, very funny, very good company, and doesn't suffer fools lightly, it's fair to say. But no, you must get him on.